Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and I'm the founder of Conscious Life, and welcome to video 2 in this 3-part video series exploring trauma and awakening with Dr. Gabor Mate and Hamid Ali, who writes under the pen name A.H. Almas. If you haven't already, please do check out the first video, which is my dialogue with Gabor, where we really explore how trauma can show up in many different ways in our lives, but also how it can have the potential to be an opening and a pathway to spiritual experiences. In this second part, in the second interview, I talk with Hamid, and particularly talking from his perspective as a teacher of many decades of spiritual realization, and the potential that exists within all of us to know our deepest selves and our deepest nature. And in this conversation with Hamid, we're particularly exploring how trauma can have the potential to be a gateway towards spiritual realization. But trauma is not just something to get away from, something that we just have to fix, but also it has the potential to be a portal, to be a gateway. If you're not familiar with Hamid and his work, let me just give you a few words of background. Hamid Ali, who writes under the pen name A.H. Almas, is the founder of the Diamond Approach to Self-Realization, a contemporary teaching that developed within the context of both ancient spiritual teaching and modern depth psychology theories. Hamid has authored 18 books about spiritual realization, including the Diamond Heart series, the Pearl Beyond Price, The Void, and The Alchemy of Freedom. He is the founder of the Ridwan School for Spiritual Development, an inner work school devoted to the realization of true nature. The orientation of the school is directed toward guiding students to realize their true nature to the fullest realization, and further still, to endless enlightenment. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Hamid Ali. So welcome, Hamid. I am really happy to be speaking with you. As I know, I've mentioned to you and Gabor privately, this is a program that I've been really excited about putting together. I think you and Gabor bring two unique and really important voices to this dialogue and this conversation. And I think as a starting point, it would just be helpful to give folks a bit of a frame when we're talking about awakening, and obviously the context of spiritual awakening. What do we actually mean by that? And there's a lot of different definitions that people would use, and I think getting that clear is an important foundation.
Yeah. Well, first, good talking with you, Alex. Good to be here. And first, when you talk about awakening, it reminds me of the Sufi saying, the Sufi position, which is that humanity is asleep. That's the state, humanity. They don't say a few people, humanity is asleep. Meaning that most people are not awake. There are only few awake people in the world. So awakening is a rare thing that happens to people, but it is possible. It is potential for all human beings. Because we have spirit or spiritual nature, what I call true nature to our being, true nature to our existence. We have true, deep, innate, inherent nature that is inherently pure, inherently incorruptible, inherently happy, inherently peaceful, inherently perfect. But most people are not in touch with it. They are in touch with what they call the self, myself, and I call the ego self, which is something normal, natural, nobody to be blame themselves for it, but because it's natural for all human beings to be a self. And the self is basically development from childhood, where it's an accretion and development of mental or psychological structures that give one a sense of identity, a sense of what they are. They're the person with such history, with such patterns and all of that. It gives them a sense of identity and a sense of orientation in the world and how to operate and all of that. But in that process, the human being loses touch with their innate, inherent nature that they come to the world with. Like babies, I think, from what I see, they're still in touch with their true nature. And then that gets lost slowly through the usual process of development of a self, and which means through conditioning, through conditioned impressions that remains in the consciousness, condition it to be in a certain way. And that becomes the self. So people recognize they are the self and they experience the world through the lenses of the self. So even the perception of the world is not exactly how the world really is. So what most people think they're seeing the world, and it's sort of relatively so. It's not exactly how the world is. So awakening means to be free from this self and to be able to experience oneself and the world free from the lenses that have developed throughout history, meaning experiencing oneself and reality completely with no filters, completely as we are at this very moment. And when we experience ourselves that way, I mean, different teachings talk about different ways how you experience yourself, but it's more experiencing yourself as pure light or pure presence, or you are what you are, or reality is what it is, not what I think it is. And so I'm saying it that way because there are different ways that awakening can happen, or there are different expressions of it. But all of them indicates we're not looking through the lens of the self. We are not being that self. We are being something else, which is our true nature, which is that perfect, happy, and generous, and compassionate beingness.
Yes. And I think a couple of pieces I'd like to open up a little bit more around this definition as well is that we're not talking about a binary, someone is either awake or asleep, for example. There is one of the phrases that I know you've used is that of endless enlightenment, that there is an ongoing path of deeper contact with oneself.
Well, that's because enlightenment has many kinds of enlightenment, and it can deepen and expand. But there is a demarcation from somebody who's not awake and somebody who's awake. It's a quantum jump. It's true that people, even in the sense of self, they are less or more conditioned, less or more stuck, suffer more or less, because the self has in it all the suffering, because the suffering both of the history that still remains and the suffering of not being connected to oneself, because true happiness and fulfillment can only come from inside, from the true beingness, true nature. So people, even though one is the ego self, this connection from the ego self can be in various degrees. That doesn't mean the person who is not that disconnected, they're awakened. They
Right.
still might not know what they are. They just to be nicer person,
Yes.
reasonable person, loving person. Not one you could say, well, they're not as stuck as somebody who's, angry and hateful and selfish and they don't care about other people. That one is more conditioned, more stuck.
one of the things for me has been so powerful and so transformational about your work is that we're not just talking about something which is an intellectual idea or something which one reads in books around realization and awakening, that there is a very felt, embodied, alive sense of one's deepening of connection to one's true self.
Yeah, the sense of immediacy is very important. Immediacy, directness, very grounded, very felt, as you said, almost visceral, although it's not physical. So the true nature has qualities of presence, fullness, textures. It is like depth or smoothness or density or fullness or brilliance. All these are both visual and sensate. So the awakened person experiences themselves that way, and that is not lost. There are people who have spiritual experiences, like in my work, many people have all kinds of spiritual experiences, spiritual access. They're not awakened until that spiritual access is continually present and they cannot be lost. You see? That is awake. Before that, we don't call the person as awakened. We say the person has some spiritual development. So any spiritual development doesn't mean awakening is a technical word used in spiritual literature, equated with enlightenment and realization.
I want to take a bit of a sidestep for a moment before we come back to this and just open up the topic of trauma. How, in your perspective, how do you define trauma?
Yeah, I know there are many definitions of trauma, and it is different trauma therapists look at it slightly differently. I learned about trauma initially from people like Peter Levine, who used to live next door when he was first developing his theory.
Oh, he did. I didn't know that.
And I was sitting working in his new clients and seeing how he does it with them. So, and there are many, his view is the most dominant in the world, from what I understand, which is that a traumatized person is somebody who had encountered some kind of experience or a situation that they couldn't handle at that age. They couldn't handle. It was beyond their capacity. And it is difficult, painful, scary, or whatever. And as a result, usually most people in position with difficulties, they either their survival instinct kicks in, so they either fight or they flee, run away. Trauma happens when you can't do either. You can't fight and you can't run away. So the other alternative that is left is that you freeze. You freeze and you dissociate because you can't handle. So the frozenness, not being able to do anything about it, you can't run away. So there's a frozenness in the system, in the nervous system, and dissociation. I mean, you're not feeling it really. You're not feeling it. You can't handle it. You're basically it becomes suppressed, completely unconscious with the content of the trauma. What's left is the effects of it that happen later in life, which create a great deal of difficulties for the person in living their life. So trauma, if there is no frozenness and dissociation, I won't call it trauma.
And there's also, I know, another lens on trauma that I've heard you speak about, that in many ways the ultimate trauma that we experience is the disconnection from our true nature.
That is an interesting perspective, because if you take that position, Alex, then the human race as a whole is traumatized. Everybody is traumatized. Now, most trauma therapists won't take that position, that the human race as a whole is all traumatized. There are traumatized people, and there are people who are not traumatized. So I usually wouldn't think of disconnection with true nature as a trauma. I will think of it as the biggest problem human being has. You see, a
Yes.
trauma is a very specific kind of a problem. This is a problem that is of a different order than trauma or not trauma. You see, as the self develops, and we talked about it through history and its impression, it can have trauma in it or might not have trauma in it, but there is always a self. The development of the ego self is the loss of connection with our true nature, with our true beingness or spiritual nature. And that, of course, becomes the source of much suffering. Most suffering that is in the world is because human people are not awakened. They're not connected with the true. Because if somebody is really connected with their true nature, which is the source of compassion and love, they can't be selfish. They can't. They have to care for people. You look around the world, it's not true. Some people are that way. Many people are not. And some of those cruel people are traumatized too, which makes them worse in their ego, because the ego, as it develops, the ego self has various forms and kinds, and many kind of neuroses, psychosis, all kind of stuff that happens. You don't call all neurosis trauma, you see. And but I do want to emphasize that being disconnected from our true nature is the basic issue, basic difficulty that any human being really is engaged in, and most people don't know it. You see, even people who are not traumatized, who don't have trauma, they don't consider trauma, that they don't need to seek trauma therapy, right? They live their life, they're married, they're generally okay, they have a good job, and they function fine in the world, you know. Those people are still not awakened, and their depth of happiness, of fulfillment is limited.
I'm interested to explore a little bit how you see trauma showing up on the path to awakening. I think often one of the catalysts for people coming to inner work is, if we take a very broad definition of trauma, they're different experiences that have been painful and difficult in their life. And there's this aspiration that if I do spiritual work, I will alleviate or reduce my suffering. Other people have no language or no sense of trauma. They just feel that something in their life is painful and difficult, and spiritual work is a pathway to hopefully alleviate that. How do you see that play out?
Yeah, so people who come to spiritual work, they come because they're suffering sometimes. Sometimes they come because there's meaninglessness in their life. They want their life to be meaningful. Sometimes they feel there's something missing. Like all their successes, they got everything working out, but they feel something is missing. Sometimes there's a deep longing for something. They don't know what it is, but they have a deep longing for something they don't understand. You see, some people have it explicitly. They want to feel connect union with the divine, or they feel, or they have experiences. Sometimes some people get in touch with something. They have breakthrough, deep insights, deep experience of oneness or unity, and disappear. And they come to spiritual work because they want to go back to that. So there are many reasons people come to the spiritual work. And, you know, in our work, my work, people who come, some of them have trauma, And there are degrees of trauma, of course. We have to remember that. And because just having a trauma doesn't mean all traumatized people are the same. Like, I will say not everybody traumatized, but traumatized people, there are degrees of them, just like there are degrees of neurosis. And so people who are deeply traumatized, who come to the work, to the inner work, to work with their trauma, I usually wouldn't accept them as students. I will send them to a trauma therapist because that's what they need. They don't need really spiritual work. They need to work through their trauma because they cannot access the spiritual nature as long as they still haven't dealt with their trauma. And spiritual work doesn't deal with trauma directly. In fact, spiritual work sometimes can re-traumatize people.
And what can also sometimes happen is people don't realize they have trauma until they start to open things up and they start to explore themselves and then realize that the reason why certain patterning is so compulsive and so strong is because of some of these traumas that get discovered.
Yeah, I find that too. That some people, after working for a while, they discovered that they have trauma they didn't know about. And there are different kinds or different degrees of that. Some people, for instance, they're moving their spiritual work, they're opening, they're having access, but then they realize there's something doesn't happen. There's some particular difficulty or particular access that is not happening. And then that turns out to be because there was a trauma that's unconscious. And so depending on the degree of trauma, I might work with them or not. If it is intense trauma, I will still send them to a therapist while I'm working with them, but they work with a trauma therapist at the same time. Some people are a trauma, they come to the work and not obvious that they are traumatized. After a while, you see they don't move, they can't learn. And when you investigate further, it turned out because they have a big trauma that they didn't know about. And those people then, in fact, there are many of those people actually. And those people, they will need to do specific trauma therapist with a specialized, trained person to be able to do the spiritual work. You can't really do spiritual work effectively if you are under the impact of strong trauma.
Yes. I'm going to change language slightly here and come to a very broad definition of trauma. In fact, maybe a better word to use is suffering. One of the things that I think is particularly important about your work, and certainly from a personal perspective, it was one of the things which was really most transformational in my own life, was this idea that suffering has the potential to be the gateway to awakening, not the block to awakening. And what I think often happens is people come across their inner pain or their inner suffering and they see it as something to bypass or something to try and transcend, to get away from. And in your work, that suffering has the potential to be the gateway. Say a bit about that, because I think it's a very important different perspective to what I think many people have around suffering.
Yeah, it is true. I mean, there are many teachings who try to transcend the suffering, to go to deep spiritual, transcendent spiritual state that doesn't deal with the suffering, that goes around it. And that way be in a state that doesn't have suffering without them having dealt with their historical suffering. So that means there's an undigested material in their psyche that they're not finished with, and it usually comes back to bite them anyway at some point. And but in the work I do, I work with a person's experience. I don't use technique to go to a spiritual place. I work with what is the person, what they bring up, you know, to me in term what is their experience in the present moment in their life, and I work with it, and a lot of it has suffering. Usually it's conflict of some kind or some kind. They don't usually most people when they come to work with me or another teacher, they don't say, oh, I'm happy today, let's work on that. They say, well, I'm sort of feeling abandoned or depressed or this and that, and or have some anxiety, or or feel like worthless or empty, stuff like that. So it is a suffering, and that's what I work with. And working with that, it has a reason, why they are that way. It's not when people were not created that way. That developed throughout their history. It has a history behind it. So working with understanding and finding out its sources, understanding the sources and feeling them, making them conscious, then they can dissolve, lose their emotional charge, and become less of a barrier to spiritual experience. And in fact, become a stepping stone to some spiritual aspects of oneself.
Yes, and to come back to what we were saying a little bit earlier, I think it's important to make the point that it's not just that suffering can be a gateway in an intellectual way of, oh, I can learn lessons from that, and
Yeah.
that was a useful thing to reflect on, but in a very visceral, felt sense, that opening to and feeling and really going through the whole of that suffering is a portal.
It is. It is also portal. But you see, any experience you have in the moment can be a portal. And suffering is usually a specific portal because that's people are focused on it. That's what they're experiencing. That's what they're presenting. So you work with that as you understand it, and as it opens up, you realize that that suffering and the conditioning or the history behind it that have created the mental construct in the mind begin to dissolve. And as they dissolve, they reveal our true nature, spiritual nature, in one form or another.
And when you say reveal one's true nature, can you say a little bit about, and of course, if this is different in different moments, but some of what that felt sense of true nature may be?
You could, for instance, deal with the sense of feeling not loved, for instance, which is common. People feel unloved and they suffer, because of it, and can create difficulties in their love life and their relationship until they deal with how come they feel unlovable or not loved. And dealing with that means dealing with the feeling of not being lovable or not loved, that which is very painful. And the history behind it. How come? They were either were not loved in their childhood, or they had love and they lost it, or limitation, and which brings in deep wounding. And as we work with the wounding, it exposes a certain kind of a gap, a certain kind of emptiness. And as the emptiness as allowed, which is the feeling, the absence of love. That's what that emptiness is, because that's what they feel. There's no love. You actually feel directly, there's no love here. If you feel that, then that becomes an opening for something to arise that feels like a palpable, soft, delicate substance almost that is filling the consciousness, filling the body, soft, smooth, delicate, and tastes sweet and makes you feel yummy and makes you feel I love. And you feel what love is. You either feel I'm able to love, I feel the question of love disappears, or you feel you are love. So that is very, the phenomenology of it is very distinct. So love is usually a beautiful softness and generosity and appreciativeness. with almost, sometimes I say it almost feels like being full of cotton candy, pink cotton candy, which is different from experiencing the absence of strength, like you feel weak, you feel castrated. And when you work with that, you get into another something else arise in you, which you feel like a strong fire, a sense of fullness, like almost like red lava coursing through your veins, and you feel strong, fiery, alive, robust, and with a fullness, with an aliveness, and uh, and the fullness feels warm, has a warmth to it, has a fiery quality to it, but it is a fluid at the same time. Feel like a warm fluid. It's a heat that doesn't burn, but makes you feel strong and courageous. That's another quality, for instance. Or
Yes.
you can feel sometimes a sense of clarity, like presence of clarity. You can feel spacious, presence that is delicate, that is precise, that is transparent, like your liquid crystal, liquid diamond.
I think what's also important to say is that initially, I think what happens is, talk from my own personal perspective. Initially, going into these holes or opening to the deficiency was a sense of I don't know what else to do. I'm. It's almost I have no choice but to explore this, and then it shifted over time from a trying to get out of pain and desperation to a genuine curiosity and love of truth, whatever that may be. And I think it would be helpful just to speak a bit to some of the different orientations of where people are meeting this work from and the
Yeah,
potential for that to evolve.
that, that means you have matured spiritually to know that you avoiding trying to get the love or the strength from somewhere else, being strong by doing sports or being loved by trying somebody to love you or trying to make yourself, look good and rich and all that so people love you. You realize those don't work. When you realize that these things don't work, that means you have already gone halfway into the spiritual development. And then you realize you can't go there. You have to go inward. And going inward, even when you go inward and explore yourself, you can't push it. You can't make it happen. You can just explore and be open. And then it happens like a blessing. It appears as a grace.
For people who are watching or listening to this that have perhaps tried different approaches where they've tried ways to get rid of suffering, to transcend suffering, perhaps they've tried more transcendental paths. What's the potential? And I know it's not about making promises because ultimately everyone's experience is different, but why is what's the potential of someone really turning towards their pain and suffering?
Is that, well, if you really don't neglect it, face it and grapple with it from a spiritual perspective, with presence and clarity, openness, and love to know the truth of it. Loving to know the truth is the heart's spiritual orientation. And then you find the truth of it, and then it dissipates because you recognize the truth of it. Before, it's there because we haven't completely felt it, we haven't faced it, we haven't completely understood it. What's it about? So the full experience and the full facing of it and the complete understanding of it, it loses what we call its emotional charge. It loses its obstructing capacity, which makes the emergence of spiritual presence or light much more likely.
Hamid, I'd love to touch a bit upon your your interest and your aspirations around this program we're putting together. I think it's important to say that this is not a heavily predefined syllabus of people are going to learn A, B, C, X, Y, Z. There's obviously some shape and some plan, but it will also be an unfolding and evolving dialogue between you and Gabor. But I'm interested to
Right.
what draws you to want to participate in this? What's your interest in getting into this topic in this way?
My interest has to do with the fact that there's lots of trauma in the culture. And trauma is more widespread than people thought at the beginning when they first discovered the trauma. There are more people traumatized than we thought. And especially, in the 20th century and now, where we have more means, we have developed, we're civilized, less, supposedly less cruelty, whatever. So you would think people are in better shape, but the fact that there is still a lot of trauma. And the trauma basically is in the way of spiritual development, is in the way of spiritual opening and spiritual learning. So I think it's important for people to know about their trauma and to work with their trauma so that they can be spiritually open, because it can be one of the biggest impediment to spiritual realization if there is trauma that hasn't been acknowledged or worked out.
It strikes me that there will be hopefully people coming towards this program who are coming more from having done a lot of spiritual work, perhaps in your school or in some other paths, that have been hitting against trauma and are interested to have new perspectives and ways to work with that. But there will also, I hope, be people that have primarily been doing the trauma work, but realize that they may have done hopefully some really helpful healing work there. But it really leaves them with a question, which is, I'm healing this trauma, but who am I beyond that? Who am I? What is my true nature that isn't my suffering?
Yeah. I think if somebody really work deeply through their trauma, they might encounter that now that I work through my trauma, it might opens up, shows them that they don't know who they are, what they are, and that might bring them to spiritual work. Not always. Some people work through their trauma and they go see a therapist and they become like a normal self, what we call a normal self. They could live their life okay without flashbacks or, intense suffering or dissociation. But they're not necessarily interested in spiritual work. Not everybody is, but some people do. And my interest is more the fact that I think that now a trauma need to be recognized. And if somebody has trauma, they need to recognize it, work with it with a specialized, skilled person, so that they'll have some relative freedom from it, to be able to do the spiritual work. And then the spiritual work will bring a deeper healing to the trauma. Because in some sense, one thing I notice about people who work with trauma and why they never get over it, they still always see themselves as traumatized, and when they're trauma, and they have a trauma identity. Because they have to have a self. They don't know but to have a self, but their self, its history has trauma. So the identity with trauma continues, and that leaves something not resolved. They can't let go of the trauma, and that's where spiritual work is very useful, because spiritual work helps you be free of the sense of self, any sense of self.
It's almost like doing trauma work allows someone to get to a point of neutral, right? To get to the point of alleviating suffering, to get to normal functioning. but it isn't just looking at it from that perspective, is not allowing someone to necessarily open to who they are, which is so much more than that.
Yeah, a lot more. I agree. So I know, like many people, I mean, the culture full of people who are doing trauma therapy. Like many with the post-traumatic stress syndrome, soldiers come back from, vets who do trauma therapy. Most of them don't go to spiritual work. They just work with their trauma and they get better. They can be okay with their families and stuff instead of being trouble for their family. But I imagine some of them do turn to spiritual work. And then they can get, I think, a deeper healing. But not just healing. They get the possibility of true happiness and fulfillment. Because spiritual work is not just healing. Spiritual work is you get healed, but you also have something positive happening. A fullness, a richness in life, and a kind of freedom and fulfillment and expansion that is, which is more than people think is possible.
Hamid, I'm really looking forward to this, and I'm really, having had some meetings with you and Gabor together, I really enjoy asking a few questions and stepping back and allowing the two of you to feed off each other in your thinking and ideas. So I'm really excited for the program.
Yeah, I think he has his specialty and I have my spiritual work, and the interaction between the two is important because there need to be a dialogue between the two, I think, because there are trauma therapists just like Gabor, who recognize the importance of spiritual work. Not all of them do, but some do. Recognizing the importance of meditation, the importance of spiritual connection.
Wonderful. Well, Hamid, I very much look forward to this. Thank you so much for being willing to participate in this, and I'm really excited to see what comes from it.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see. Yeah.
I hope you found that conversation helpful. Also, a reminder, if you haven't already watched video 1 in this 3-part video series of Dr. Gabor Mate, please do watch that as well. I think both Gabor and Hamid have such powerful perspectives and lenses on these enormously complex and nuanced areas. Now, if you found these interviews helpful, that may be the end of your time exploring this, but I hope that this is the beginning of a journey, not the end of a journey. In our 3rd video, I'm going to outline a deeply powerful online program produced together with Gabor and Hamid. This is a 4-part in-depth training exploring trauma and awakening from both of their perspectives, and both of them teaching separately, but also 2 of the sessions with Gabor and Hamid together. So if you'd like to find out more about this program, please do watch the 3rd video in this series.